let's make another one of these. But more wow, just wow.
Welcome to the Macke Makerspace.
Hi, I'm Brother Bob Macke. I am the curator of meteorites at the Vatican Observatory, and we have been working on an HO scale model of the Church of St. Ignatius in Rome, where in the mid-19th century, Father Angelo Secchi built an astronomical observatory on the roof. And in this observatory, Father Secchi pioneered several fields of astrophysics. Now, we have a lot to do. We're going to install it in the church, and we have to get this thing done by the Jubilee year. So, there's a lot to do. Let's get started. Where we last left off, all the major parts had been printed, and when spread out, it fills an entire room. Thankfully, there was a room available at the Vatican Observatory that I could use for staging, painting, and assembly. Next, we have to prepare all the pieces for painting. I'll start by filling in some of the gaps between pieces with putty. I use standard modeling putty here, but by the end of the project I discovered stucco, which is easier to apply and to clean up. It just takes a bit longer to set. Next, the requisite sanding. Everybody loves sanding, right? It's so much fun, yeah. Nothing I would rather do than sand, sand, sand. Next is a base coat of paint. Instead of primer, I'm using white acrylic, which is a bit cheaper, and I'm trying to work it into all the little print lines and stuff. The first layer doesn't have to be pretty, just good coverage. On top of that, the same white acrylic is stippled in a thicker layer. This is going to help disguise print lines and eliminates the brush strokes. And it also provides a rough texture for the walls that I think is a little more interesting than just a flat surface. Okay, so now we can spray on the color. My plastic bin spray booth was too small for most of these parts, so I had to improvise a new one out of an office printer box. Lights on! Pretty much everything gets a base coat of Vallejo Middlestone. Please don't fill the comments with a critique of how bad my airbrush technique is. I know, I really know. I'm still fairly new to airbrushing, but I'm getting better. As the Italians say, pian piano. I then lightened the exterior walls a shade or two with a light coat of white over top. It was hard to get everything the same shade, but it's all close enough that even the real church isn't all that uniform. The parts of the walls that face inward are a bit darker and grayer, so I added a layer of medium gray instead of white. The cornices at the top of the walls get painted off-white, slightly beige, with a tiny bit of brown and yellow thrown in. It's hard to see on camera, even when I compare it with the unpainted piece, but it's more visible in person. Trust me, would I lie? Now for an old crowd favorite, a bit of wash to bring out the details on these cornices. In the past I would have used black wash, but I found that gray is a little bit better on these surfaces.
But you still gotta clean it pretty thoroughly or else you just end up with gray cornices. Let's speed this up a bit. Now for the facade. I've put off painting the facade because, quite frankly, it's frightening. It's the first thing anyone sees about the church, and the paint job isn't simple. I start by covering everything in that off-white travertine base. And all the detail bits get a gray wash to dirty them up a bit and also to make the details really pop. Now for the tricky bit. The travertine contains striations across the entire exterior. It's one of the most distinctive features of the rock, so I have to try to replicate it, but it's really easy to screw everything up right here. I'm starting with the very watered down gray wash and a brush with the bristles all spread out. I'm using it to very lightly paint striations, but even that is going to get pulled back by wiping it up with a cloth. The steps get some light gray to stand out a little from the facade. I'm also giving the tiles a base coat of the same light gray, but then covering it with rust color. It's still a little dark for the actual tiles, but not too bad. Oh, and the back of the facade gets the same wall treatment as the other parts. Now that the paint is done, I can finally glue in the big window. None of the church windows are stained glass, thankfully. I didn't have to color them. That really simplified the paint job. And the doors also get glued into place. By the way, I slapped white paint on the interior of the church so the lights will reflect more and make it brighter. And the tiles get a bit of light gray pigment powder to tone them down a bit and cut back any shininess. I tap off the excess and collect it on a sheet of paper so I can put it back in the container for another project. So now let's paint the lower walls along the west side of the church. This is mostly the same as what I just did on the upper walls, but with beige instead of Middlestone. It gets a light gray over top, which will bring it slightly closer to the other color. And now for the trim, which is travertine. I start by masking off the rest. Then give it the same off-white as the facade. In removing the masking, I discovered that the tape sticks a little too well and it pulled up some of the underlying paint. And in some cases, that's going to be covered up. But in others, I had to try to patch it. I'll admit I didn't do a great job on that. And then there's the gray wash on the cornices. The columns also get the travertine striations just like the facade. The capitals get gray washed before being added to the walls, and that'll help keep the walls from getting too messy. The same gray wash for the window frames and the door frame. The rear side door also gets darkened with a dark wash. Then dry brush with brown to pick out the edges where the paint would have worn away. The door can now be glued into the frame. And now for the side windows. I'm using clear resin for this. This first needs to be printed on the Elegoo Mars, and I'll take advantage of this opportunity to show off the process. Fresh off the printer, it looks great. I use water rinsable resin, so it goes in a water bath. And I'm gonna rinse it twice, changing out the fresh water in between each rinse. The pieces pop off the build plate with only a little help. Removing supports is super easy, barely an inconvenience. And then a short time under UV to cure the pieces. Next, I need to paint the metal bars on the window. This is also pretty easy with a flat surface coated in metallic gray. The raised edges take the paint, leaving the rest of the window clear. And now it can get glued into the window frame. Time for wall assembly. I'll start by popping the door into the space cut out for it on the styrene wall panel. And likewise for the window. The rest of the windows also need to be inserted. Now the wall panels get glued into the 3D printed framing structures. For the transept, because of a design oversight, I need to slide these side panels in from the side. Because of this one error, I couldn't assemble the whole wall frame as one unit before painting, and that produced some visible edge lines. Oh well, live and learn. Now to assemble the wall together. You can see some of those lines I was talking about. Finally, the capitals get glued in place. They will cover up some of the worst of the errors and also break up the lines so they aren't all so obvious. On to the roof tiles. Let's start by putting putty in all the gaps. Next, a nice coat of rust color. Here's more great footage of my awesome airbrush technique. These corner pieces get painted by hand. And let's jump to the balustrade, which gets a coat of off-white. Now to secure all the pieces in place. The gaps get some stucco, which can be smoothed out by hand without sanding, as long as it's done before it dries. And a different shade of off-white goes on the horizontal panels. Now for the finishing touches on these side walls. These oval windows are blackened because they access the space above the vaulted ceiling, which is not lit from inside, so I don't want light to shine from them. The big windows, however, remain clear. I think that all looks pretty good, don't you? Now the tiles over the buttresses can be glued into place. And the sidewall is basically done. A couple other details go in place, like this grill over the apse to keep the birds out. And these stairs. Now we can finally direct our attention to the observatory. Before we can paint the exterior, we have to close it up and seal the gaps. But before we do that, we have to install instruments and furniture in the Meridian Dome. So here I'm painting parts for the Meridian scope, clock, windows, etc., and most of it's done off screen. And of course we have to pop in some clear plastic for the windows. And now to place them. The meridian scope is permanently aligned on the north-south line and can only go up and down. Gotta place a Jesuit also. Now the roof pieces can get glued on. If I'd done this first, there's no way I could have put anything inside. The corridor also gets closed up, but I'll leave the Mertz dome open for now. That's because the dome is such a separate part that it can be added later after everything is painted, so I can add the scope and other furniture later. To cover the seams, I'm applying some stucco. Now the openings to the interior have to be covered up so we don't accidentally paint the insides. I'm giving it the same basic treatment as the walls, though with a beige base layer. and the detail colors get applied by hand. Now to remove the masking. So satisfying. These windows and other external details can now be inserted. The secondary meridian doors are applied. You can't see inside this room, so I didn't bother furnishing it. This window will turn out to be a problem in a few minutes. You'll see what I'm talking about. The Meridian Dome sliding roof panel gets some dry brush silver for that metallic effect. And there are these support wires. I'm not exactly sure how they work, but they appear in the historical drawings. And I'm going to apply them with super glue. And the roof panel fits nicely on the dome. I just printed the Mertz telescope. This is far more accurate than the one I made for the original project. It gets a special paint job. The Mertz refractor was installed in 1854 and had a 24 centimeter aperture and a focal length of 433 centimeters. Angelo Secchi attached a prism to the end of this telescope, breaking starlight into its spectral lines. Based on these spectra, he classified over 4,000 stars by spectral type, and his classification work was later adopted and expanded to form the classification scheme that we still use to this day. This is just one area in which Angelo Secchi was a true pioneer of astrophysics. All of the pieces just friction fit together without glue, and that's going to allow me to pose it for maximum effect. It goes in the dome. I'm carefully placing the pillars so it lines up on the north-south line. And despite its size, I printed the dome itself out of resin instead of filament plastic so that it could catch the details better. If you remember the original video, I had to make creative guesses about the dome because it no longer exists. And different references show subtly different designs. I chose to make this one along the same interpretation, but better. Once painted with the windows installed, it looks pretty nice, don't you think? The dome slit lets you see the telescope pretty well when the interior is lit up. For a final touch, it needs a lightning rod. I made this out of a toothpick and some jewelry wire. The ends of the wire get painted white and then have a gray wash to help hide the glue spots. And now a little metallic dry brush on the lightning rod. Okay, time to put the domes in place. This is the Cauchois telescope dome, painted in the same way as the Mertz dome. Speaking of which, that also goes on now. Light test. Wow, let's take a few moments to enjoy this thing. The slit on the Mertz dome is not going to be aligned with the telescope pointing. Instead, I'm choosing an angle that'll make it easier for an outside viewer to look inside the dome and see the telescope and stuff. And now, finally, the observatory complex can be installed on the church. It was a bit tricky to get it in without snagging the rat's nest of wires for the lights, but eventually I managed it. I'm just putting the roof back on here, something I did several times before in test fits, so I didn't think there would be a problem. But I hadn't accounted for the addition of new window frames. This window here in particular is blocking the roof. Thankfully, the glue wasn't that strong, so it popped out easily. After fitting the tiles in place, I can put it back where it belongs. And to finish closing out the walls, the rear section and apse go back in place. Off camera, I put back the gray side buildings as well. Before we can call the project done, we have to do a few finishing touches. First, the lantern domes need to be painted. These are the domes that sit above the side altars. I'm starting with a base of copper. I originally intended to use the airbrush, but I bought the wrong kind of paint and didn't have any alcohol to thin it, so I just use a brush here. It gets mostly covered by sponge dabbing pale blue over the surface, followed by a bit of zinc green, and a tiny bit more blue to blend it. Now it gets a white wash. This will fade the colors and lighten it up a bit, also making it seem somehow much older. You can see the effect by comparing these two side by side. The windowed caps also need to be painted. They get painted white. I guess I could have used an airbrush for this, but I was already using ordinary brushes, so I didn't bother to switch. Once the paint is dried, clear resin diffusers slide in place. Now it all gets glued together. Let's turn our attention to the drain spouts to line the walls. We'll make these out of 2mm armature wire, which comes in rolls like this. So the first step is to cut pieces and straighten them out. Here's a quick hack for straightening armature wire real fast. Just roll it between two flat surfaces. The cut ends need to be filed flat. I 3D printed this jig for bending the wire at exactly the right spot for where the pipe goes into the wall. And then the wire gets trimmed and filed flat. After spraying on some primer, the wire gets a dark metallic silver. I know it's ironic that I'm painting metal to look like metal, but hey, it's a different metal, so there. And now they get glued in place. I'm using super glue, so I have to be real careful about the placement. And now the lantern domes can finally go in place as well. For the noon ball, we start with a bamboo skewer sanded to a taper. This will be the pole. The observatory of the Roman College served as the official timekeeper of Rome. Every day at noon, they would lower a giant ball from a pole just behind the facade. Observers at Castel Sant'Angelo would watch for the ball drop, then fire a cannon to announce noon to the city. The tradition of cannon fire continues to this day, though the cannon has been moved to the Janiculum in Trastevere. From old reference, it appears that the ball was probably something like a canvas sack wrapped around a wire frame, very light, so I'm reproducing the cloth appearance by gluing some tissue paper onto the ball. Once the glue dries, it'll be quite convincing. And it gets painted a dark brown with lighter brown dry brush. I don't know the actual color, but this seems to match the hue fairly well. This topper will simulate the pulley mechanism. The really tricky part is wrapping the cabling over the pulleys convincingly, but I managed it in the end. And it all gets super glued down. The cable has to come back through the ball to reach the bottom of the pole, and again, I don't know the actual arrangement that was used, so I chose what seemed reasonable. Now to glue in the base and thread the cables in there. And again, this is more of a suggestion than historically accurate. That being done, it's finally time to make the cross that tops the facade. It's made from wrought iron, or in this case resin, painted to resemble wrought iron. Now to finally attach the cross and finials. The noon ball goes right behind the cross. From the ground it wouldn't block the view of the cross, but from above it does kind of interfere with the aesthetic. Oh well. Even though I made the finials in the first part of the project, I saved their installation to the end because it's so easy to catch one on a sleeve and just pop the top off. Ask me how I know. That's also why I secured the sleeves of my lab coat for these last steps. Now for a Jesuit waiting at the front door. Who is he waiting for? Why, this carriage, bringing two nobles, of course. And with that, the build is done. The next step is delivery and installation, which occurred in December. We loaded the model into a van and drove it from the Vatican Observatory all the way into Rome to the Church of St. Ignatius. Unfortunately, I don't have much footage of the actual delivery and installation because, well, quite frankly, I was too busy actually installing it to film anything. Sorry about that. Anyway, I did manage to catch some footage of the church crew installing the transparent barrier that keeps the tourists from damaging the model. That's pretty much all I managed to record. Then on December 15th of 2024, we had a nice celebration in which I and a few others spoke about Secchi and his observatory. After that, we unveiled the model and all the attendees had a chance to get a close look at it. I got a lot of positive comments about all the little details. The model will be on display at least for the Jubilee Year 2025 and hopefully beyond.
So here it is installed in the Church of St. Ignatius in Rome, right next to the tomb of St. Robert Bellarmine. And I think if you ever have a chance to be in Rome, stop by the church and take a look at it. I think this is really worth a visit, as well as the other things to see here in this wonderful church. This project was in fact sponsored by the Church of St. Ignatius, and I would very much like to thank several people here, Father Vincenzo D'Adamo and all of the staff here who really supported this project quite a bit. And also the Vatican Observatory. So my project is not sponsored by the Vatican Observatory, but I did make extensive use of facilities and resources there. In fact, I could not have done this without the space made available at the Vatican Observatory. The purpose of the Vatican Observatory is to be a sign to the world of the compatibility of faith and science and of the Church's support of science. And it could use your support. If you'd like to support the work of the Vatican Observatory, or even just to learn a little bit more about it, there is a link in the description. Please check it out. So except for pictures, which you'll see in just a moment, that's all I have for right now. In the meantime, please do like and subscribe and turn on notifications so that you'll get notified when the next project comes out. I do have more projects in the pipeline. And until next time, peace. So here it is, installed in the Church of St. Ignatius. Isn't it great? Oh, the light's not on.